The studio lights of The Late Show with Stephen Colbert shone bright, casting an almost surreal glow over the set. Laughter echoed through the room as the audience buzzed with anticipation. They were in for another night of witty satire, biting political commentary, and playful jabs. Millions more were tuning in at home, eager to join the laughter that had become synonymous with Colbert's late-night empire. But tonight, something felt different. A sense of tension hung in the air. As Colbert took his place behind the desk with his signature smile, there was an unmistakable undercurrent of something more profound than the usual evening banter. The guest seated across from him was Karoline Leavitt, the youngest White House press secretary in history. Known for her platinum blonde hair and sharp, piercing gaze, Leavitt represented the conservative side of Gen Z, fiercely loyal to the Trump administration and unafraid to stand her ground. "Tonight, we're joined by a very special guest," Colbert began, his tone light, the glint of sarcasm still dancing in his eyes. "Karoline Leavitt, White House press secretary. Are you here to defend Trump, or maybe teach me how to make TikToks for your generation?" The audience erupted in laughter. It was classic Colbert, a light-hearted dig, wrapped in layers of sarcasm. But Leavitt, sitting with her arms crossed, didn't flinch. Her calm demeanor made it clear she wasn't going to play the game by Colbert's usual rules. "I'm here to speak the truth, Stephen," she shot back, her voice cool and steady. "Something you might not have tried after 2 decades of sitting behind that desk, turning everything into a punchline." The laughter that had filled the room moments ago faded. The shift was palpable. The audience, once buzzing with excitement, fell into a stunned silence, unsure of how to react. Colbert, caught off guard by the swift counterattack, briefly paused. The atmosphere in the studio had shifted from jovial to tense. For a brief moment, Colbert's trademark smile wavered, but he quickly regained his composure, leaning forward, hands on the desk. His voice dripped with sarcasm as he responded, "The truth, huh? Karoline, tell me, do you think satire has changed the world, or do you believe only your White House speeches can do that?" The audience chuckled, some clapping, still clearly in Colbert's corner. But Leavitt didn't seem to be fazed. She remained composed, her sharp eyes locked on him. "Satire," she began, her voice calm but cutting, "is just an excuse for you to dodge responsibility, Stephen. You mock everything, politics, people, even serious issues. But what have you built from it? You make your viewers laugh, they go home, and the world stays the same. Meanwhile, I stand in front of the press every day, facing real questions, giving real answers, and defending what I believe in." Her words hung in the air like a weight. The audience, still reeling from her sharp retort, began to murmur. Some applauded her, but many simply stayed silent, waiting to see how Colbert would respond. Colbert's gaze sharpened, a flicker of irritation passing over his face. His fingers tapped rhythmically on the desk, an unmistakable sign that he was formulating a comeback. "You say I don't put myself at risk," he said, his voice soft with a hint of challenge. "I've been criticized, threatened, and even sued for what I say on air. I don't just sit here reading a script, I question people in power, like you and your boss. I do it my way." Leavitt's response was immediate, her voice rising slightly but still perfectly controlled. "Questioning? No, Stephen. You throw stones and hide behind laughter. You don't face real consequences. You've got a team writing your jokes, room full of people ready to clap for anything you say. I stand alone in front of hundreds of reporters every day. No script, no hiding place. I put my career, my reputation, and my beliefs on the line. You call that risk? I call it privilege." The room was now quiet. The audience's earlier laughter had given way to whispers, some nodding in agreement with Leavitt, others exchanging glances, unsure of how to interpret her challenge. Colbert's smile faltered again, replaced by a moment of introspection. "Really, Karoline?" Colbert asked, his voice turning more serious. You make it sound like I'm some clown in a circus. But if I'm not doing anything, why are you here on my stage, defending your honor? Leavitt didn't take the bait. She leaned forward, her voice calm but unwavering. I'm here because you mock what I, and millions of others, believe in. You think it's a joke, but to us, it's real life. You can laugh, but don't expect me to sit quietly while you turn it into a circus. For the first time that night, Colbert's usual charm faltered. He stared at Leavitt, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. The audience, sensing the change in the air, waited in anticipation. Colbert, the master of control, had met his match. He took a deep breath, trying to steer the conversation back to familiar territory. Karoline, you're tougher than I thought, he said with a nervous chuckle. But we're just getting started, right? Leavitt's expression didn't change. Her eyes were locked on his, unwavering. We'll see, Stephen. We'll see. The audience, previously on Colbert's side, now seemed divided. Some clapped politely, but many were more intrigued by Leavitt's composure. She wasn't here for the laughs or the applause, she was here to make a point. Colbert, realizing he couldn't break her, leaned back, his expression shifting. Okay, he said, attempting a more relaxed tone. You've got my attention. But, let's talk about something else. Satire, you say, doesn't build anything. So, tell me, Karoline, what exactly are you building? Leavitt's gaze remained steady, unflinching. I'm building something real, Stephen. I work with people who believe in something greater than themselves. You make jokes. I make change. I don't need applause or a crowd to tell me I'm doing the right thing. I'm here to defend what I believe is right. And that's something you, with all your jokes and sarcasm, can't ever take away. Her words were direct, piercing through Colbert's defenses like a well-placed arrow. The room grew quiet again, the laughter that once filled the air now replaced by a deep sense of reflection. Colbert, for the first time, seemed unsure of how to respond. What have you built, Stephen? Leavitt continued, her voice gaining strength. You've built a career mocking people who put themselves on the line every day. You think it's harmless, but it's not. You've hurt people like Jake. Colbert's brow furrowed. Jake? Who's Jake? Leavitt's expression didn't waver. Jake was a young man I worked with on the campaign. He was smart, dedicated, and believed in what we were doing. But after one of your jokes, Stephen, everything changed. A video of him went viral, mocking him, turning him into a laughingstock. He wasn't a celebrity. He didn't have hundreds of thousands of followers to defend himself. He was just a regular guy, trying to make a difference. And he lost his job, his dignity, all because of a joke. Because of people like you. Colbert's face turned pale, and the room fell into an eerie silence. His usual ability to deflect had failed him. He opened his mouth, but the words didn't come out. Leavitt didn't stop. Jake didn't give up. He came back, not for the fame or the money, but because he believed in what we were building. He didn't need the spotlight. He just needed to know that his work mattered. The weight of her words sank into the room, and for the first time that night, the audience understood the true gravity of the conversation. It wasn't about jokes or political jabs, it was about real lives, real consequences, and the impact of words. Colbert took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging slightly. I'm sorry for what happened to your Jake, he said, his voice softer now. But you can't blame me for every consequence that comes from a joke. I don't aim to ruin anyone's life. I just want to entertain. Leavitt shook her head. You don't get it, Stephen. This isn't about entertainment. This is about responsibility. You make jokes, but you don't face the fallout. You don't see the consequences of your words. The room had shifted. The tension was gone, replaced by something deeper. A sense of clarity had settled over the studio, and Colbert, for the first time in his career, was being forced to confront something larger than his usual jokes. "I don't hide from my words," Colbert said, his voice stronger, but still trembling. "I've been criticized, threatened, but I stand by what I say. I believe in what I do." Leavitt's eyes locked onto his, unwavering. "Do you? Do you really believe in what you do? Or are you hiding behind laughter because you're afraid to stand for something real?" Colbert swallowed hard. He had no answer. The studio grew silent again, the weight of Leavitt's words heavy in the air. The audience sat still, sensing that something monumental had just happened. Finally, Colbert took a deep breath and leaned forward. "Karoline," he began, his voice quiet, "you're right. Maybe I've been hiding behind laughter. Maybe I've been more about the joke than the substance. But that doesn't mean I don't care. I've spent my career questioning people in power, challenging the system. I may not do it the way you think is right, but I've tried." Leavitt nodded, her expression softening slightly. "I respect that, Stephen," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But I think you've missed something important. Success isn't about the spotlight or the applause. It's about the people who stand with you when the lights go out. The people who still believe in you when there's no camera, no crowd." Colbert sat back, his hands resting on the desk. He had no more jokes to hide behind. This wasn't a moment for satire. This was real. For the first time in his career, he understood what Leavitt had been trying to say. Success wasn't just about making people laugh or questioning the powerful. It was about what you built, who you built it with, and who would stand by your side when the stage lights dimmed. Leavitt's words had struck him to the core. And for the first time that night, he could do nothing but nod in acknowledgement. "You're right," he said quietly. "I've learned something tonight. And maybe, just maybe, it's time for me to rethink how I do things." The audience erupted into applause, not for a winner, but for the rare moment of mutual respect that had unfolded before their eyes. Colbert, with his trademark smile, nodded to Leavitt. "Okay, Karoline," he said, "I think we've had a real conversation tonight." Leavitt gave a small smile, a gesture of quiet victory, but her gaze remained steady. "I didn't come here to win, Stephen. I came here to speak my truth. And I think we've done that." The room buzzed with energy as the applause grew louder, not because of a punchline, but because of the powerful moment that had just unfolded before them. It was a moment of reflection, of understanding, and of learning. As Colbert settled back into his chair, he looked at the audience. "She's no joke, folks," he said, his voice carrying a newfound respect. "But I'll still try to make her laugh next time." Leavitt chuckled softly, but the intensity in her eyes didn't fade. "I'll consider it, Stephen," she replied, her voice playful yet firm. The audience stood, their murmurs blending into discussions about what they had just witnessed. It wasn't just a battle of words or ideas, it was a clash of beliefs, a rare moment where both sides left with something more than they had come with. And as Leavitt walked off the stage, her confidence unwavering, Colbert sat back, his smile now tinged with humility. He had been challenged, forced to confront the weight of his words and the impact they had on the world beyond his jokes. It was a moment that would stay with him, and with everyone who had witnessed it. A moment where laughter met responsibility, and the world of entertainment collided with the realities of the people it affected. And in that moment, Colbert wasn't just a comedian. He was a man, forced to reckon with the power of his own words. The applause faded slowly, leaving a contemplative silence hanging in the studio. Colbert sat still, hands clasped tightly in his lap, staring out at the audience as if lost in thought. The usual spark in his eyes, that familiar glimmer of wit and sharp humor, was gone. What remained was a man reflecting, not on his next punchline, but on the deeper implications of what had just transpired. Karoline Leavitt had left an indelible mark on him. For the first time in years, Colbert was not the one controlling the narrative. He had been called out, not in a playful, comedic way, but with the force of conviction and belief that, for a fleeting moment, had stripped him of his usual armor of sarcasm. The usual banter that characterized the Late Show had been replaced with something much more real. Leavitt's words had cut deep. The story about Jake, the campaign worker whose life had been upended by one of Colbert's jokes, still echoed in the back of his mind. How many times had he, too, turned people into punchlines, never fully considering the fallout? In his years of mocking the powerful, had he ever truly stopped to think about the personal consequences for those who became the subject of his humor? The camera zoomed in on Colbert as he straightened in his chair, his usual composure returning, but now with a rare sincerity. He gazed at the audience, his hands resting on the desk in front of him. "I think we all learned something tonight," he began, his voice softer than usual. "It's easy to stand behind jokes, to throw a quick jab at the powerful or the unpopular. But it's a lot harder to take a hard look at the impact of those jokes, the people who might be affected, and the responsibility that comes with them." A murmur spread through the crowd, the weight of his words not lost on them. They had witnessed something rare on television, a host who had been genuinely challenged, who hadn't responded with a witty retort but with self-reflection. Colbert continued, his voice gaining strength. "We joke about power. We mock the people at the top. But the truth is, sometimes the real heroes are the ones who stay out of the spotlight, who put their work in without ever seeking applause or recognition. People like Jake, who are quietly working behind the scenes to make something meaningful, something lasting. They don't need to be in front of a camera to prove their worth. It's easy to laugh at someone's expense, but it's not so easy to take a step back and question the consequences." The audience, previously divided in their loyalties, now nodded in agreement. The atmosphere in the studio had shifted from one of casual amusement to one of deeper understanding. Leavitt's story about Jake had made an impact, but Colbert wasn't just acknowledging the emotional weight of her words, he was beginning to understand them. His usual bravado had given way to something more introspective. He had spent so much of his career laughing at the powerful, but now, he was considering whether he had been blind to the real-world consequences of his actions. "Karoline, I don't agree with everything you stand for," Colbert said, his tone still serious but tinged with respect. "But I respect the fact that you're willing to stand up for what you believe in, even when it's not popular. You've made me think, and that's not something I can say very often." Leavitt, for her part, didn't offer a smug smile or a victory lap. She simply nodded, her expression steady. "I'm not here to win, Stephen. I'm here to make people understand that responsibility isn't just about who makes the loudest noise or who gets the most applause. It's about who you stand with when the lights go out. Who's still there when the cameras stop rolling." Her words hung in the air, and the audience could feel the weight of her message. Colbert, who had spent years using his show as a platform to poke fun at those in power, was now reflecting on the idea that true success wasn't about the laughter or the recognition. It was about the foundation you built with the people who stood by you, the ones who had your back when no one else was watching. The tension in the room had dissolved, and in its place was a deep sense of reflection. Colbert and Leavitt, despite their ideological differences, had found a common ground in the value of responsibility and integrity. Colbert leaned forward, his eyes meeting hers with a new understanding. "You've made a real impact tonight," he said quietly. "I may not agree with everything you believe in, but I can't deny the strength of your convictions. And for that, I have to respect you." Leavitt's expression softened, her sharp gaze giving way to something more sincere. "Thank you, Stephen. I didn't come here to tear you down. I just wanted to have a real conversation, something that's been missing from a lot of the media today." The audience, who had been watching the battle unfold in front of them, now began to show their appreciation, not for the comedy, but for the conversation itself. The usual applause for Colbert's clever quips was replaced by a more subdued, thoughtful response. Maybe we've all learned something tonight, Colbert mused. It's not just about what we say or how we say it. It's about the impact our words have. And it's about standing for something, even when it's hard. Leavitt nodded, her voice calm but resolute. Exactly. You might make people think, Stephen, but I want to make them act. That's the difference. The audience now responded with genuine applause, not for a winner or loser, but for the rare honesty that had emerged on that stage. Colbert, the man known for turning everything into a punchline, had been forced to confront a truth he hadn't fully considered before. And Leavitt, unyielding in her beliefs, had shown that sometimes, standing up for what you believe in doesn't require a stage, it just requires conviction. As the applause died down, Colbert raised his hand, signaling for quiet. He looked at Leavitt, his smile returning, but this time, there was no sarcasm in it. You're tough, Karoline. I won't lie, this has been a real challenge. But I think it's one of the most important conversations I've had on this show. Leavitt smiled back, her eyes still firm but carrying a hint of warmth. I'm glad we had this moment, Stephen. It's not often that we get to really talk about these things. The cameras panned out, capturing the moment, the rare moment where two people, despite their differences, had found common ground in their shared humanity. The laughter, the jabs, the back and forth had all given way to something deeper. A conversation about responsibility, about success, and about the real cost of words. As Leavitt stood to leave, the audience erupted into applause once again, not out of loyalty to one side or the other, but because of the rare sincerity they had witnessed. Colbert watched her go, his smile tinged with respect, and as the studio lights dimmed, he knew that this moment would stay with him for a long time. He had been challenged, not just by his guest, but by the truth she had laid bare before him. And for the first time in a long while, Stephen Colbert didn't feel the need to hide behind a joke. He simply nodded, acknowledging the lesson that had been taught. Outside the studio, the echoes of that night reverberated across social media, with viewers still discussing the debate long after the broadcast had ended. The hashtag Leavitt vs. Colbert trended, with opinions split, some praising Leavitt for her boldness and conviction, others defending Colbert's right to satire. But what everyone could agree on was that the night had been anything but ordinary. It had been a conversation, a clash of beliefs, that challenged the way we view success, responsibility, and the power of words. And in the quiet aftermath of the show, as the crew packed up and the cameras were turned off, Stephen Colbert sat alone for a moment, reflecting. Perhaps laughter wasn't everything. Maybe there was something more important at stake, something bigger than the next joke or punchline. Tonight, he had learned that. As the studio lights flickered off, signaling the end of the broadcast, Colbert remained seated, staring at the empty desk before him. The usual hum of activity in the background, the crew packing up, the producers discussing the show's performance, seemed distant, almost muffled. Colbert's mind was elsewhere, his thoughts occupied by the conversation he'd just had. He'd been a comedian, a satirist, a host who prided himself on his ability to turn every serious issue into a punchline. But now, the gravity of Leavitt's words had shifted something deep within him. She had done more than just challenge his views, she had made him rethink the very foundation of his work. Leavitt's message had been clear, and it had stuck with him. Success, she said, wasn't just about who could make the crowd laugh the loudest. It wasn't about who had the most applause, the biggest audience, or the sharpest jokes. It was about something more lasting, the quiet dedication of people like Jake, who worked behind the scenes, who didn't seek the limelight but whose contributions were no less important. It was about the people who would stand with you when the stage lights dimmed, when the applause faded, and the cameras turned off. That was the moment Colbert had found himself in. The crowd had applauded for both him and Leavitt, not because one had triumphed over the other, but because they had witnessed a rare kind of honesty. A rare kind of confrontation. It was the kind of conversation that didn't have a winner or loser, it was just a moment of raw truth, a meeting of minds where both sides had been forced to consider the larger implications of their actions. As the crew began to file out, Colbert slowly stood up from his desk, his legs a little unsteady, almost as if he were waking from a deep sleep. His usual confidence, the brashness that had defined his career, felt less certain now. Leavitt had brought him face to face with something he hadn't truly acknowledged before, the power of words and their consequences. His assistant, a young woman who had been working with him for years, approached him with a clipboard in hand, her face lit with a hopeful smile. "Great show tonight, Stephen," she said, looking at him expectantly. But instead of the usual response, Colbert simply nodded, a thoughtful look in his eyes. "Yeah," he murmured, his voice distant. "It was different." The assistant hesitated, sensing the change in his tone. "Is everything okay?" Colbert let out a soft laugh, but it was not the usual self-assured chuckle. It was a sound laced with vulnerability, something rarely seen from him. "I think I just learned something tonight. Something I haven't been paying attention to." The assistant, unsure of how to respond, just nodded, recognizing the weight in his voice. There was a shift in Colbert, an understanding, a moment of reflection that couldn't be dismissed with a quick joke. He wasn't sure what it meant for the future of his show, but he knew it would change the way he approached it. Outside the studio, the night had fallen, and the bustling streets of New York City carried on as usual. But inside Colbert's mind, the world felt quieter, more contemplative. As he left the set and stepped into the backstage area, the hum of the city outside seemed almost surreal, as though it were a world apart from the one he'd just inhabited. Colbert had always been a master at using humor to deflect, to challenge power, to expose the flaws in the system. But now, for the first time in a long while, he found himself questioning the system, his own approach to it. Was laughter the only way to spark change? Or could true change be something quieter, something built over time, in the spaces where people worked without recognition? Leavitt had made him realize that maybe there was more to fighting for what you believe in than making people laugh at the expense of others. He had always thought that his jokes could change the world. But Leavitt had made him wonder, could humor really change anything, or did it just distract people from the work that needed to be done? Her message had stayed with him, long after the applause had faded. Success wasn't about who could make people laugh. It was about who was still standing when the lights went out. That night, after the show had ended, Colbert sat at his desk for a long time, just reflecting. The world of comedy had always been his escape, his weapon. But now, it felt like he had to step out from behind the curtain and see the world with new eyes. He wasn't sure what that meant for his future on television, but one thing was clear, he couldn't keep pretending that the only thing that mattered was the next joke, the next laugh. The next day, Colbert went into his office with a new perspective. As his team gathered around for the usual morning meeting, they could sense the change in him. He was quieter than usual, more contemplative. When they discussed the scripts for the next week's episodes, Colbert didn't immediately jump to his usual sarcastic commentary. Instead, he listened. Really listened. "You know, guys," he said after a long pause, his voice calm and serious, "I think we need to make sure we're not just making jokes for the sake of making jokes. We've been poking fun at people for years. It's time we start asking ourselves what we're really trying to accomplish with that humor." The team looked at him in surprise. Colbert had always been the one to drive the jokes, to push boundaries, to make fun of the powerful. But now, there was a new sense of purpose in his words. A sense that he was finally ready to consider the impact of his work, beyond the laughs. As the meeting continued, Colbert contributed more than he usually did, offering feedback that was thoughtful and measured. The usual quick-witted remarks were absent, replaced by a desire to take the show in a different direction, one that still entertained, but also invited reflection, discussion, and maybe even understanding. In the weeks that followed, The Late Show took on a new tone. The laughter was still there, but it wasn't just about the jokes anymore. Colbert began to incorporate more in-depth discussions about the consequences of the news, exploring the real-world impact of the political and social issues he had always mocked. It wasn't a complete departure from his comedic roots, but it was a shift, a deeper dive into the issues, with a clearer focus on accountability. The audience responded to the change. They still tuned in for the humor, but now they found themselves engaged in the conversations, reflecting on the points Colbert made about responsibility, power, and the true meaning of success. It wasn't the easy comedy they were used to, but it was something that felt more meaningful. And all the while, Colbert kept thinking back to that night with Karoline Leavitt, the night he had been forced to confront his own work and his place in the world of media. It had been a challenge, a moment of reckoning, and it had changed him. As time went on, Colbert continued to evolve, his show becoming a place not only for laughs but for thoughtful conversations about the world and the role of humor in it. The laughter didn't stop, but it took on a new layer of meaning. Colbert had learned that, sometimes, the most important stories weren't the ones that made you laugh, they were the ones that made you think. And though he would never stop being a comedian, that night with Leavitt had taught him something profound. Success wasn't just about getting the last laugh, it was about who was with you when the laughter faded. And that, he realized, was the true measure of impact. The true measure of success.